Before I begin session 2 of the Priceless Pearl, I need to make a correction on something I said at session 1. I said that volume 13 of the Baha'i World had Rahia Khadem's articles about the passing of the guardian, and I said that in that Baha'i World you will not find the program for Shoghi Effendi's passing, which is in the article, The Passing of Shoghi Effendi. I was wrong. It is in volume 13, but it's not at the end of the article like I'm used to, so I missed seeing it. So you do have the program of Shoghi Effendi's funeral in London in volume 13. I think I might need to not apologize, but in a way apologize that my sessions are very intimate and homey rather than scholarly, which is what you will discover when you read The Priceless Pearl. I also have on that list another book that I didn't recommend last session, but it's on the list that Neda, and it's this book called A Tribute to Amata Baha Rahia Khanum, written by Violette Nachavani. I mention it because if you can't go through the 2-volume book of the Maxwells of Montreal, it would be enjoyable for you to read Violette's book, A Tribute to Amata Baha Rahia Khanum. I read it again this week, and I think it only took me about 2.5 hours. So now I'll begin my notes for session 2 of The Priceless Pearl. Amata Baha Rahia Khanum opens up The Priceless Pearl with a quote directly from part 1 of Abdul Baha's Will and Testament, which refers to Shoghi Effendi and from where she gets the title of the book on his precious life. Salutation and praise, blessing and glory rest upon that primal branch of the divine and sacred lote tree. Grown out, blessed, tender, verdant, and flourishing from the twin holy trees. The most wondrous, unique, and priceless pearl that doth gleam from out the twin surging seas. We know the history of that period of great danger to Abdul Baha that necessitated his protection of the faith in the hands of, at that time, a mere child, his eldest grandson. In paragraph 2, Rahia Khanum wrote, although already appointed the hereditary successor of his grandfather, neither the child nor the ever-swelling host of followers of Baha'u'llah throughout the world were made aware of this fact. We know of Abdul Baha's escape from the above danger, yet suffered others, particularly from within the family. The readers of the biography will learn that Shoghi Effendi inherited those problems of the covenant breakers, within and without the faith. Shoghi Effendi was to be given time to grow under his grandfather's wing. The believers, however, in the East and the West, began to question the successor to the master. Thus, we find on page 2 a letter from Abdul Baha that not only verified a successor, but describes him. I'm sure you'll remember this. O maidservant of God, to the person who got the letter. Verily, that child is born and is alive, and from him will appear wondrous, excuse me, and from him will appear wondrous things that thou wilt hear of in the future. Thou shalt behold him endowed with the most perfect appearance, supreme capacity, absolute perfection, consummate power, and unsurpassed might. His face will shine with a radiance that illumines all the horizons of the world. Therefore, forget this not as long as thou dost live, inasmuch as ages and centuries will bear traces of him. One will be constantly moved to read of Abdu'l-Baha's love for Shoghi, which literally means the one who longs, a name that the master said was conferred by God upon his grandson. What is this longing? Rahia Khanum records a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha addressed, "O God," and goes on to state, "Thou hast given to whomever thou willest, and bestow upon him the name Shoghi, so that he may yearn for thy kingdom and soar into the realms of the unseen." In the first chapter of The Childhood and Youth of Shoghi Effendi, the reader will learn of the normacy and uniqueness of Shoghi Effendi. Let's compare these two descriptions from She Who Knew Him Well, though not as a child, Rahia Khanum in The Priceless Pearl. Already in these earliest pictures, one sees a sadness, a wistfulness, a haunting predilection for suffering that is like a shadow on the wall, the shadow of a child magnified to the stature of a man. And then in another part of that chapter, she writes, "It may sound disrespectful to say the guardian was a mischievous child, but he himself told me he was the acknowledged ringleader of all the other children. Bubbling with high spirits, enthusiasm, and daring, full of laughter and wit, the small boy led the way in many pranks. Whenever something was afoot, behind it could be found Shoghi Effendi." I may interject here a somewhat similar playful child, Mary Maxwell. You know that she grew up with another young Baha'i, her lifelong friend, Paul Haney, who she describes, in my words, a pure, innocent soul. When their group of friends got into some mischief, they would run away from the scene, leaving Paul to deal with the consequences. Both were to be appointed by the guardian as hands of the cause of God. Paul was to be one of those hands who resided in the Holy Land during the period of the custodianship. He was still there during my years at the World Center and died while I was there. I won't go into the details of Mr. Haney's death in a car accident, but I'd like to relate the respect shown his station as a hand of the cause of God and recognition of a life spent every day in service to the cause of Baha'u'llah. With 3 other ladies, I was on a short R&R stay in Tiberias on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, when the news of Mr. Haney's passing was telephoned to us late at night. We were expected to return to Haifa for his burial, which we did, leaving very early in the morning the next day. Returning to the Priceless Pearl. Besides the special love Abdu'l-Baha had for little Shoghi Effendi in that first chapter, Rahia Khanum also conveyed the deep love of Shoghi Effendi for his grandfather. She recalls pilgrims and early believers witnessing scenes of, shall we say, a mystical connection between the older unique successor of Baha'u'llah, and the young child who would be his successor. One of those sweet scenes was seeing the small, beautiful child enter the room where the believers were sitting with the master, eyes merging with his grandfather's eyes as he walked towards him, never gazing away, never uttering a word. Then kissed the hem of Abdu'l-Baha's garment and respectfully left the room. You read of Shoghi Effendi's devotion to serve and the master providing the means for that service, with schooling locally in the Middle East and eventually Balliol College at Oxford. The vision of Shoghi Effendi was to serve as Abdu'l-Baha's secretary. Abdu'l-Baha was preparing him for becoming his successor and head of the faith of his great-grandfather, Baha'u'llah, an overwhelming task that would eventually be laid on the shoulders of the 24-year-old youth. Another publication to be recommended is Riaz Khadem's 2014 Prelude to the Guardianship. On the title page is added how Abdu'l-Baha prepared the young Shoghi Effendi for the office he was destined to assume as guardian of the cause of God. Chapter 2 of The Priceless Pearl carries us through Shoghi Effendi being called to the London office of Tudor Pole, who had received the cable from the greatest holy leaf of the passing of Abdu'l-Baha. Shoghi Effendi, as you recollect, saw the cable on Major Pole's desk when he was not there, and he fainted. You will read of the need, because of the shock on his health, that he had to be escorted back to Haifa with the devoted Baha'i British believer, Lady Bloomfield. Then the second blow was given, the reading of the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha, appointing him the head of the faith meant for the entire world. His sphere of service would now be the entire world. Here is what Rahia Khanum wrote on page 44. Shoghi Effendi likewise discovered he was the expounder of the words of God. Think about this. Prior to leaving Haifa for Oxford, the young grandson had helped his grandfather correspondence, particularly in English. He was probably translating Abdu'l-Baha's unerring interpretation of the writings of Baha'u'llah, and now he was the sole interpreter of the verses of God. Let's start that paragraph on page 44 again and continue. Shoghi Effendi likewise discovered that he was the expounder of the words of God. Now, these are Rahia Khanum's words. And that anyone who opposed, contended, or disrupted with, or disbelieved in him had done this to God. That anyone who deviated, separated himself, or turned aside from him and done this to God. And that the master had evoked the wrath, the fierce indignation, and the vengeance of God upon such a one. He also learned that he was the irremovable head for life of the Universal House of Justice, and that he and that body would unerringly be guided by the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and that what they decided would be from God. Anyone disobeying him or them, anyone rebelling against him or them, would be disbelieving and rebelling against God. What a uniqueness in the history of religion. There are so many uniquenesses in this latest faith of God. We could make a healthy list of them. Shoghi Effendi would be high on that list. There has been nothing like the uniqueness in the history of religion. Another one would be that the faith is protected from division, spiritually and materially. Spiritually, because it's the promise of Baha'u'llah, this is a day that shall never be followed by night. Materially, because of the covenant of Baha'u'llah, appointing Abdu'l-Baha the center of the covenant, the head of the faith, an unerring interpreter of the sacred writings. Abdu'l-Baha's will and testament then did the same with the guardian, Shoghi Effendi. Early in the ministry of the guardian, he had to deal with covenant breakers. The most serious of their sins and unjust actions was causing the keys of the inner tomb of the shrine of Baha'u'llah to be held by the authorities, and their desecration of the mansion at Baha'i. Palestine then, Palestine then was under the authority of the British. Shoghi Effendi would be corresponding with such officials as the governor of Akka and others, pleading his case. Rahia Khanum wrote, "It was no doubt due to these contacts that the authorities decided in favor of the guardian, and the key was officially returned to the legitimate Baha'i keeper of the shrine, from whom it had been wrested by force over a year before." Perhaps you've seen a black and white photo of the mansion, the sacred building where Baha'u'llah passed away, that was taken when the covenant breakers lived there and in the adjoining two-story building next to the mansion. The photo is not in the Priceless Pearl. Viewing that photograph would bring any faithful lover of Baha'u'llah to tears. The guardian not only restored the mansion to its former glory, but had the side building completely torn down and used the rubble to create a two-terrace garden overlooking the gardens in front of the shrine. Shoghi Effendi envisioned 3 terraces. The third was erected after his passing. Today's pilgrims continue to take the stairs up those terraces and recall the guardian's action. Shoghi Effendi continued expanding the gardens, both at Baha'i and in Haifa. Like most news in all respect of the faith, he kept the believers apprised of the expansion and development of the property. Rahia Khanum records his sending to the believers acreage figures he kept of the growth of the property, beautifying all the holy places. She wrote that he was not interested in gardening. He was interested in gardens. When they traveled to Europe, they would visit gardens, and he would ask questions of the gardeners. Once, she verbally related to us, he asked at a well-known large garden in England how many tended to the garden. The answer he was given surprised him. It was only 2 gardeners. They explained to Shoghi Effendi that small tasks like trimming were done before they became large tasks. Also during those trips, particularly in England, Shoghi Effendi would pick up garden ornaments that still grace the gardens today. Such ornaments came from estates that were being sold off, and he could purchase them at a great saving to the faith. When I had the joy of breakfast with Fujita for almost 4 years, among the stories he told me was being with Shoghi Effendi when the Guardian was studying where a supporting wall would be built near the shrine of the Bab. I'm not good at heights, but it looked to be more than 10 feet tall, maybe 20 feet tall. Shoghi Effendi told Fujita that he had been advised to slant the wall, but the Guardian's vision was the wall would be straight. What did Fujita think? Fujita, who was an educated man, agreed with the advice given Shoghi Effendi, believing that it would be stronger for retaining the weight of the large volume of soil. But the Guardian, whose view was the wall would go up and down straight as an arrow, built it that way, and it is still standing silent, solid, and long-lasting to this day. I had heard that if there was a choice between beauty and utilitarianism, Shoghi Effendi chose the former. The House of Justice followed and continued that dictum. I'll relate just one story in this respect. While I was handling the telephone switchboard for the World Center, an Israeli tour guide called to ask that we get rid of the red tile fragments that lined the garden paths and put in asphalt paths. Those clinking shards were difficult for tourists to walk on, especially the elderly. I assured the tour guide that I'd pass on his recommendation. Of course, the House of Justice would never consider it. The red path with its green lawns was the vision of Shoghi Effendi. Indeed, one of my many trips to England found me overlooking the hills of Torquay. The local Baha'i showed me where Shoghi Effendi got that vision. The hills we were looking at consisted of red soil and green vegetation. Now, the paths leading directly to the holy places are covered with white pebbles. Such pebbles, I'm told, come from only one place in Israel, the shores of the Sea of Galilee. One project that Rahia Khanum asked of a few of us was to dig up all the pebbles in front of the master's house. Over the years, the pebbles had sunk deeper into the ground. They needed to be gathered, washed, and relaid. I brought a couple of photographs from my album taken during that project. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's the front of the master's house. Rahia Khanum is on the left in front of the shovels against the tree. Mary Ann is that brunette with the V-neck shirt behind the fish pond. She did not come that day as just a supervisor. She herself got her hands dirty, as we would say. Okay, forgive me for taking more time to relate another personal story. Perhaps you can forgive me by looking at the story as an example of the many tasks that needed to be done at the World Center that most Baha'is don't even think about. But I think these are tasks that serve the cause, and we'll get some brownie points in heaven for performing these services. The personal story is of my small connection with the ornaments that I spoke of in the Baha'i gardens, particularly at Baha'i. There were a number of stone urns on pedestals that had lead tulips. And these pedestals and urns with the lead tulips were scattered around the gardens at Baha'i. At one time, years ago, the tulips had been painted various colors. The Holy Places Department wanted to replace the paint with gold gilding. Amos Gibson, one of the original 9 House of Justice members and convener of the Holy Places Department, asked me to do the removing of the paint. The tulips were delivered to my flat on the Mediterranean, which had an open patio. So that you don't think I was living the life of a socialite, the building was a plain, square British mandate house with 4 flats, 2 up and 2 down. My flat was down and just about 8 feet from the tideless Mediterranean Sea. Mr. Gibson provided the highly toxic paint remover and rubber gloves needed to use that remover. Many weekends were spent on the project. As you expect, the weekdays were used serving in the offices of the House of Justice. Even with the rubber gloves, the skin of my hands felt like they were being burned. When I got to the last lead bouquet of painted tulips, and in an eagerness to get the job done, I recklessly and quickly pried open the paint remover, which immediately exploded in my face. My first concern was damage to the eyes. I rushed into the flat and washed the eyes and face with lots of cold water. Both survived my carelessness. There is so much to record. There is very much recorded in the brilliant written The Priceless Pearl. Much of history is covered, much of which readers may be familiar with. What isn't recorded in other books, how could there be, are Rahia Khadem's day-to-day awareness and participation in what Shoghi Effendi worked on, wrote, related, and suffered the last 20 years of his life. The book, however, is not just about those 20 years. Rahia Khadem wanted to tell the whole story of the unique pearl. What an overwhelming task, but she wanted the believers to know their guardian. You know that Rahia Khadem loved Shoghi Effendi, not just as a wife to a husband, but as her guardian. She treated the Universal House of Justice the same way. One time at the World Center, I was given the job of producing a small World Center directory. It wasn't a big job and needed done only periodically. When one came out, Rahia Khadem asked me why so-and-so's name, address, and phone number were not in it. I replied, the House of Justice told me not to put him in the directory. That was all I said. She accepted this and asked no further question. She didn't ask if I had any idea as to why. The House had decided that, and that was all she needed to hear. Small as it is, this goes back again to her instant, exact, and complete obedience. Besides the large and worldly life's work of the Guardian, such as his translations and writings, Rahia Khadem shares many personal experiences, such as the simplicity and dignity of their marriage ceremony, excerpts from her diary, and personal conversations with the Guardian. Interjecting another story, You know, Ali Nachavani, with his mother and brother, lived in the Holy Land for many of his younger years after the passing of Ali's father. Violette told us that when she and Ali were married, Ali told Violette, his new bride, that in their lives, Baha'u'llah would always come first. Violette said she thought about this and replied, well, that will have to be the same for me. Shoghi Effendi explained to his wife what life was like in the master's house when Abdu'l-Baha was alive. Simple things like gathering for breakfast. There is a small room at the back of the house near the exit to the gardens. And that little room has a series of storage cabinets. Lined up on the top of those cabinets are a series of samovars. Rahia Khanum told us that some of those were used by Abdu'l-Baha, but because nobody knew which ones, they had to keep them all. The last time I was in Haifa for those 28, 29 days, and after the passing of Amajad Baha Rahia Khanum, Nell Golden took me to the master's house, which I was told took 2 years to be restored. I must admit that the personal side of me was sad to see the changes. Setting myself aside, I understood the importance of stations. This was historically and spiritually Abdu'l-Baha's house, not Rahia Khanum's, not even Shoghi Effendi's, though they lived there together for 20 years and she for 63 years. Think of small coincidences in the faith. There are twin holy houses, Baha'u'llah's in Baghdad and the Bab's house in Shiraz. Pilgrim sites. There are the 2 houses of Abdu'l-Baha, the house of Abdullah Pasha in Akka, where Shoghi Effendi was born, and Abdu'l-Baha's in Haifa, where the master lived, and as did Shoghi Effendi as the guardian. Both of those houses, pilgrims have the moving privilege of visiting. Lest you think that Shoghi Effendi was erased from the master's house, there remains the 2nd floor on the left side of the holy place as you see it from the street. This 2nd floor was built by the greatest holy leaf, Far the Guardian. Rahia Khanum gives us an intimate view of the tender love between the greatest holy leaf and Shoghi Effendi. She tells us how when Shoghi Effendi returned home after his long day of work, he would rush into the greatest holy leaf's room to prevent her from getting out of her sickbed. He knew that when she heard his arrival, she would want to stand to greet him in respect for his station. His respect for the sister of Abdu'l-Baha was similar. In a way, they were vying with each other in sincere humility, that the other had the greater station. Bahia Khanum, the leading female of the dispensation of the faith, and the sister of the mystery of God, Baha'u'llah's chosen successor, Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, the head of the faith after his beloved grandfather's passing, and interpreter now of the verses of God. Ali Nachavani more than once related the cute story of when he and his brother were quite young and had followed the guardian from the mountain where he had supervised work on the gardens. Shoghi Effendi passed through the master's house gate. The boys did the same. The guardian walked up the steps and into the house, followed by the young lads. Then they followed the guardian into the room of the greatest holy leaf, quietly staying there as the guardian shared his day's activities with his great aunt. When the boy's mother was told where her sons were, she was not happy. They were intruding on the private time of the guardian and the greatest holy leaf. Cracking open the door, she strongly gestured that they come out of the room. Ali reported to us, or both of them, that they didn't feel right just abruptly leaving the room. They approached Shoghi Effendi, extended their hand, and expected Shoghi Effendi to shake their hands, which he graciously did. When they got out to Mother, she, of course, reprimanded them for what they had done with intruding on the guardian's time with the greatest holy leaf. After reprimanding them, she questioned them. Did you really shake the hand of the guardian? Well, they assured her she did, that he did. So she grabbed their hands and covered them with kisses. Ali loved telling that story. I wish you could see his lighted up, happy face when he recalled that time as a little boy with the guardian. Back to the priceless pearl. Did you know that when Shoghi Effendi asked for the hand of Rahia Khanum in marriage, he placed on the finger of that hand a ring that his great aunt had given him years before? Did you know that it was the greatest holy leaf's room that their marriage vows were exchanged, though she had passed away 5 years before? Then the couple went to the shrine of Baha'u'llah. Where else could you read the truths of the personal history of Shoghi Effendi? The priceless pearls share so much, and his broken-hearted widow wrote 451 pages, painfully researching and recalling a life cut short in service to the cause, to the believers, to us. Shoghi Effendi was in Switzerland when the news of the passing of the greatest holy leaf reached him. Like the passing of Abdu'l-Baha while Shoghi Effendi was in England, he wasn't there to hold her hand or say goodbye, temporary as that separation was. The first thing that he did was plan for her grave and a suitable memorial. With that infallible guidance, it seems that he was led to design a structure connected with Baha'u'llah's world order. As most of us know, the grave site is a monument of 3 circular steps, 9 Corinthian pillars, topped by a dome, all in white marble. Relating it to that world order, the steps symbolize the local assemblies, pillars, the national assemblies, and the dome, Universal House of Justice. When the remains of the other significant relatives were transferred to the monument gardens, that same design was used for their burial sites. As the Guardian wrote us in a cable in 1939, sister, brother, mother, wife, Abdu'l-Baha, reunited on spot designated constitute focal center Baha'i administrative institutions at Faith's World Center, none of which had been built yet. On page 148 of The Priceless Pearl, Rahia Khanum writes, he, the Guardian, said, the conjunction of the resting place of the greatest holy leaf with those of her brother and mother incalculably reinforces the spiritual potencies of that sacred spot, which was destined to evolve into the focal center of those world-shaking, world-embracing, world-directing administrative institutions ordained by Baha'u'llah. It is not an accident, friends, that the architect, Hussein Amanat, designed the seat of the House of Justice, where the consultation chamber, the window of which is above the entrance, is directly across the monument of the greatest holy leaf and towards Akka. Nothing designed for the world center is an accident. Another aside. Prior to the completion of the seat of the House of Justice on Mount Carmel, many of the believers were already writing to the World Center, wishing to know if there would be a specific occasion for its formal opening. The House of Justice rightly replied that there weren't any plans yet. Cutting this story short, for a few years, the World Center staff held seminars on the central figures of the faith, always, of course, on a Saturday, our only day off. The one for the Bab was in a small community hall at the bottom of the old terraces. The one on Baha'u'llah was held under the arcade of the mansion at Baji. The one on Abdul Baha, I believe, was at Mazaret. By the time the seminar on the greatest holy leaf was to take place, the staff had risen to about 300 people. The only facility large enough to hold the attendees was the reception hall of the new seat of the Universal House of Justice on the Ark. In its message of 26 July 1982, the House of Justice shared with the believers that the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the passing of the greatest holy leaf had just taken place, and mentioned an all-day seminar on Saturday, July the 17th, held in the main hall on the ground floor of the seat of the Universal House of Justice. The seat of the Universal House of Justice had been dedicated. Let's return a moment to the world order as this session is being wrapped up. Friends, there is so much to think about in respect of Baha'u'llah's words on his world order. Think of the projection of the world order of Baha'u'llah into the distant future. Another book that is so often recommended is Ali Nachavani's Shoghi Effendi, The Range and Power of His Pen. Here is what Mr. Nachavani said to 90 youth from 25 countries gathered in Quito, Italy in 2006. During the most great peace, the institutions of the faith will effectively be world-shaking, world-embracing, and world-directing. This is near the end of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah as I read the Guardian's letters. The world's equilibrium has been upset through the vibrating influence of this most great, this world order, which is in the Kitabi Aqdas, will have become a reality. We are assured that a world civilization is going to emerge by virtue of the impact on this wondrous system, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed, also in the Kitabi Aqdas. This is Ali Nachavani. Shoghi Effendi is telling us that even he could not visualize the wonder and glory of that civilization. I thought about the phrase, the like of which mortal eyes have never witnessed. Mortal eyes have never witnessed. Undoubtedly, the spiritual eyes of all God's manifestations have witnessed it, my humble deduction, as this world order of Baha'u'llah is the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy that the government shall be upon his shoulders. An appropriate time to repeat another short story that I've shared before, recalled now because of that prophecy and in respect of the beloved guardian's wife and helpmate. At the readings of the names of the members elected to the Universal House of Justice at the international conventions, the 9 men are asked to stand on stage as each name is announced. After that action during the 1983 International Convention, Amita Baha Rahia Khanum spoke to the delegates. I well remember her saying, through no fault of their own, the salvation of the world rests upon the shoulders of these 9 men. I'd like to close this presentation reading 4 sentences from page 148 of the Priceless Pearl. Rahia Khanum wrote, when Abdul Baha's mantle as head of the faith fell on Shoghi Effendi's shoulders, a great change came over him. What the nature of that change was spiritually is not possible for us, so infinitely remote in both station and stature, to grasp or to define. Many times he used to tell me, when they read the Master's will to me, I ceased to be a normal human being. The always personable and noble young man, now and ever increasingly as the years went by, had the stamp of kingship in his face, his manner, his walk, his gestures. That precious will and testament, again, one of the uniquenesses of the Creator's latest religion, is very much about the world order of Baha'u'llah. How little we believers of the first 2 centuries of the faith can comprehend the role played by Shoghi Effendi as guardian and one to begin erecting Baha'u'llah's world-encompassing order. We are told that Shoghi Effendi's work will be influencing centuries to come. We heard it in the words of Abdul Baha just minutes ago. The Priceless Pearl is not only educating us here and now in the 21st century, but masses of believers in those future centuries. On behalf of those future centuries, we thank Amita Baha Rahia Khanum for the Priceless Pearl. And I thank you for sharing the session too.
I was in Haifa in January 1982, and the outside part of the Universal House Justice was built, and I got engaged on July the 9th, 1982. When was it dedicated? July 7th?
July the 17th, I think it was, 1982, yes.
July 17th, yeah.
I think I said it was July. The message was July the 26th, and the seminar was July the 17th. What I didn't share was in the front of the audience, and I was in about the 3rd seat, 3rd row at the hall, was of course Amita Baha Rahia Khanum, Hussein Amanat, the architect, the one who was missing was Amos Gibson.
Yeah.
For 10 years, had hands-on with the building of that seat as the convener of the Holy Places Department. His absence was felt by everyone.
Yeah, I remember he couldn't meet us, and he died not long after he got back from.
Yes. He had terminal cancer, and his children were spread all over the world. And in spite of his illness, he went to all those places to visit his children. And we thought we were sending him to his death. But he came back and passed away at the Haifa hospital.
Marianne, I wanted to say, because you might have indicated that you thought maybe the sharing your stories, you would apologize for sharing your personal stories, but to me, you're enhancing the narrative. Because for me, it's a reminder of our connection, the presence of former workers from the Holy Land. And I've told you and Marvel and others this before, I think gives a special connection to the World Center that we don't have before. And the stories that you shared, the rest of us would not be able to share that. And, it just brings it more personal, what you said about the Guardian. So thank you for your personal stories. I think they're a great addition.
Thank you, Dennis. Very kind. I enjoy telling the stories because really it's like I'm reliving them. They're so precious to me. And they weren't actions in life that I thought would be recalled as I got older. I didn't think I'd live this long. I was just going to say, I hope these stories and the paper I read continues to encourage you to read these books yourselves, and of course, particularly The Priceless Pearl.
We have Helen too.
Marianne, will your photos be going to the National Spiritual Assembly Archives eventually?
I think I mentioned one time I sent 27 pounds of papers to the archives in Haifa, and I haven't decided about my pictures. I have given away my World Center slides to friends in California because most of them the World Center Audiovisual Department has. Whenever I had film developed in Haifa, it was done by the Audiovisual Department, and I have a feeling that they made copies of it before they gave me my copies. So I haven't decided what to do with the photographs. I have one whole album that I'm sending to the National Assembly of Taiwan because of a trip made in Taiwan by myself in 1978. And in 1979, Amita Baha, Rahia Khanum, and Violet Nachavani went to Taiwan. And some of my pictures are of pictures taken while she was in Taiwan. I don't know if the World Center has those. I would love to give them to some historian who could deal with these photographs, but I don't know.